war in Ukraine has again brought up an old question of whether or not tanks are obsolete. The poor performance and high loss rate of Russian tanks in Ukraine seems to suggest it's possible. So far, Russia has lost roughly 1,400 tanks, which is a staggering number considering the war is only 7 months old. And these numbers are based only on images that are confirmed by Oryx. It's likely that there's dozens or even hundreds more damaged, abandoned, or destroyed that we just don't know of yet. So, are they obsolete? Or maybe they need to be rethought and completely changed to confront an enemy on the modern battlefield. After all, battleships used to be the king of the ocean, only to be rendered obsolete by more advanced carriers, destroyers, and submarines. So, is there an alternative to the tank? But first, real quick, our sponsor this week, Bloodline. It's a hero collector fantasy RPG where you build up your kingdom, collect champions, upgrade, and defend the land. It's got great gameplay, awesome graphics, and a ton of ability to customize. You can even create your own unique legendary champions by combining bloodlines of elves, demons, demigods, orcs, and more. One element that I really like is that you have the ability to go in and make political and economic decisions through the Senate. And if you haven't tried Bloodline yet, right now is the best time to get started. They just released their biggest update ever, and they're starting their Halloween event in Vampire Clan. Through it, you'll be able to obtain an accursed champion for free on the 7th day, so make sure you join in. And of course, it's all free to play, both on Android and iOS. So go and check it out. Download through my link in the description or scan the QR code here. When you do, you'll get a special starter pack worth $20 that includes 10 energy potions, 100,000 gold, and 100 diamonds. So don't miss out on getting such big rewards. And don't forget again to get started with their Halloween event that's starting October 27th. So go and check it out. Again, Bloodline. First, while Russia losing 1,400 tanks is huge, there is some important context as to why these tanks are being defeated. Roughly half of those were just damaged, abandoned, or captured, and a lot more of them are likely able to be repaired. A lot of times, crews simply abandon dozens of perfectly fine tanks. And this represents 3 major points that we need to address before we can answer the question whether or not tanks are obsolete. First, many of these tanks were likely just out of fuel or just needed some simple spare parts to continue operating, which was due to how quickly the war began. Many commanders and experts in Russia's government and military likely only had a few hours to prepare for the invasion of Ukraine, which is nowhere near enough time to prepare all the spare parts and other vital aspects of war. And this was made only worse by the speed of the war, like how fast Russia was trying to get to places like Kyiv. The second point is related. Because of the speed, supporting units such as artillery, electronic warfare, and air defense coverage failed to keep up, and that left a great deal of Russian tanks and ground forces alone and vulnerable. Without this support, it doesn't matter how good your tank or crew is, it's gonna lose. And then the third point, Russia is using a huge mix of tanks. Mostly T-72s, but a lot of T-90s, T-80s, and even T-62 tanks. And that makes logistics a lot more complicated. The T-80s in particular use turbine engines, not a diesel engine. This means a different type of fuel, and they also consume fuel at a greater rate, which, interestingly, could explain why we see a higher number of T-80s abandoned than others. Likely just because they ran out of fuel and difficulty finding spare parts for their unique engine. It's also important to mention that if we compare how many of these tanks were lost from different units, and who were commanding these units, there were a few different generals here, I'm not even going to try to pronounce their name, but that were in charge of the 4th Tank Division, 200th Motor Rifle Brigade, and the 2nd Motor Rifle Division, 1st Tank Regiment. They sustained far more losses than any others. And indeed, these 2 commanders were quickly relieved of duty. Some of this higher loss rate could be explained that these units had to fight in more difficult battles, but it also implies poor leadership. So it's clear that it's not necessarily fair just to look at whether or not Russia's tanks were the issue, but it seems more like Russia's leadership is the real key issue as to why Russia has suffered so many tank losses. But even still, even if tanks were at fault here, the question itself, are tanks obsolete, is missing an important context. A better question would be, what can fulfill the role of a tank better than tanks could? With that question, there really isn't much else available that could do the tasks. One attempted solution was pretty much mating a big gun with an infantry fighting vehicle, which resulted in the Striker MGS. But it didn't work out very well, and it's now being retired. One of the big issues with tanks is modern ATGMs, and this is what most people will talk about when they're talking about whether or not tanks are obsolete. The Striker MGS, while it was more mobile, was still too slow to dodge missiles, but it was also too big to hide from them, and it lacked the armor of a tank for protection. So again, it was not a solution for replacing a tank. Active protection systems could help, but again, they could also be put on a tank. Tanks also can't just be replaced with infantry using shoulder-launched weapons like Javelin or NLAWs to defeat armor or enemy fortified positions, because infantry are not mobile enough, and they suffer from being too vulnerable. And putting them in APCs or MGSs that can hold infantry still suffer from the issues mentioned earlier as well. Drones and aircraft alone also can't replace them, as aircraft need to be refueled and rearmed more frequently, and they cannot hold ground like a tank could. So until someone could come up with a better vehicle or a concept that could fulfill the ground forces needs that a tank currently fits in, the tank is likely here to stay for many decades to come. And if we look at how many nations are still buying tanks or upgrading them, this seems to be the same conclusion many militaries are coming to as well. But more importantly is the type. Currently, most tanks used are main battle tanks. These are heavily armored, typically weighing 55 or more tons. In the past, there were all sorts of tanks. Light tanks, medium, heavy, and even super heavy. After phasing out its last light tank in 1978, the US has been searching for a replacement. Many programs were started, but they then failed with budgetary issues, technical issues, and so on. Light tanks not only could assist and complement main battle tanks, but they're also easier to transport, they can cross bridges and roads that are unable to support heavier MBTs, they're quicker, air mobile, and more suited for armor recon, fire support, and much more. This need finally led to the General Dynamics Griffin II. It's armed with a 105mm rifled gun in the form of the XM35, which appears to be able to use all the same ammunition types that the M68 gun was designed for, which, at the time of writing this, is likely the same ammunition that the Stryker MGS was using. It has modular armor, which again, at the time of writing this, is said to have protection from cannons up to 30mm in caliber. However, until we see more about this vehicle, it's still speculation. And the US is not the only major nation that is adopting or using light tanks. Russia has a light tank that is undergoing a modernization program called the Sprut SDM-1. It's rather well armed for a light tank, using a 125mm smoothbore cannon that is derived from the same cannon that Russia uses on their main battle tanks like the T-90. It's also reportedly going to be equipped with a second generation thermal imaging unit, giving it great nighttime capability, which, as we've seen in Ukraine, is desperately needed. It weighs only 18 tons, which is much lighter than the Griffin II's reported 38 tons and China's Type 15 33 tons. This does come at a cost though. The Sprut is based on the BMD-4 chassis, which only has a maximum protection against cannons up to 23mm, so it's not well protected. Another light tank is the Chinese Type 15. The Type 15 is supposed to replace their current Type 62s. China recognized the need for a light tank early, as they noticed that heavier vehicles would have a difficult time in the likely terrain that they would be fighting in, such as mountain ranges, hills, rice paddy fields, rivers, etc. Being much lighter than their Type 99 main battle tank, it's estimated that the PLA could store and deploy twice as many Type 15s as they could Type 99s, which is another real important factor when regarding their potential use in Taiwan, where they'd have to be shipped or flown in across the strait. And that brings up one final point. There's no one-size-fits-all solution for tanks. They're often designed to be most efficient in the theater that they're expected to fight in, which will vary from country to country, which is also why any list you see of what is, quote, the best tank is mostly pointless. And these light tanks might be a solution to replacing some roles that main battle tanks play today, but they're not going to replace them completely. So, in conclusion, while tanks might change in their size and weight, there will most likely always be a tank in the ground forces of armies across the world for many decades to come.